The following program is a Town of Colony television production of the William K. Sanford Town Library.
It goes all my life's a circle, sunrise and sundown. The moon rolls through the nighttime till the daybreak comes around. And all my life's a circle, I can't tell you why. Seasons spinning round again, the years keep rolling by.
Top of the day. I'm Joe Doolittle.
And I'm Kate Detting.
And this is Story by Story.
Celebrating the human spirit.
And we are spiritual storytellers? Well, maybe not spiritual. Spirited.
You can be the spiritual, I'll be the spirited.
Well, we've got a lot going on in spirits. It's springtime, finally. And that's been, well, of course, we had a little bit of springtime all winter.
Yeah. It's been a very easy winter, a soft winter.
Well, and you know, as I was coming out today, I have a neighbor that taps his maple trees. And he's had his taps out off and on for about 3 weeks. But they were running pretty good today. Oh. So this was a good day for making sap run.
That's definitely a sign of spring.
Sign of spring. Other signs of spring, maybe you've seen them out there, but they're few and far between at our house. But it's still not snow on the ground. So
right.
Yeah.
Right.
Now we're going to bring you an hour about storytelling, and we're practitioners of the art of the spoken word, and it's actually one of the oldest art forms, we think, in the human condition.
That and music.
That and music.
I won't arm wrestle any musicians about that, but we're before they were drawing pictures on the caves in France. They were telling stories and writing songs about it before they got to the pictures. I'm sure of that. I was there with my little spear, and this mastodon came out of nowhere.
Right. Well, one of the things about story that I encountered this month was, you know what, when you're sitting in church and you hear the scriptures read or something, and you know the story about the little kid with the bag and the fish and the stuff, and that goes on, and you know you heard that story before, and you know how it comes out, and but you sit there and you begin to kind of think about it in a different way because you're just sitting there. And I realized that stories are important when they're repeated. And I've been invited the last couple of years to tell the story of the 4 chaplains at a memorial service at the Veterans Administration for the 4 chaplains who were killed when the troop ship they were on sunk, and the ship ran out of life jackets, and the 4 chaplains, a rabbi, a priest, and 2 Protestant ministers, gave away their life jackets. And one of those ministers was the minister of my church, a young 30-year-old guy named Clark Poling. And I've told that story at this memorial service for about 4 years in a row. And everybody's heard it, and before that, they've heard it many times. But it's in the repetition that the memory comes back. And I think the acknowledgement of the faithful, heroic act sits again in the room. And it's a very wonderful thing for a sad story to be that continually inspiring.
And the repetition is valid because even if I've heard the story, you've told the story so many times, you're not the same person you were the last time you told it.
That's true.
Things have happened to you since then that have somewhat shifted your worldview, your personal view, your local view. So I think I knew somebody, Connie from up north. She was in Story Circle, I don't know. Yeah. And she read War and Peace every decade. Wow. Because she wasn't the same person.
Wasn't the same person again. That's a very good point. So that the nature of the teller is different, and that makes the story a little different. And the listener, you listeners are always changing, and that's part of the wonder. So that's my one reflection for my month as a storyteller was the nature of telling the same story to the same audience, and having it still be generative. How about you?
I had a cold, so some things got canceled.
Some things oh, bummer.
I told a story. Actually, it was the first story I worked on with Janine Laverty. I told that at Word Plays, that one of the reasons I came into storytelling was my parents died when I was in my 30s, and then my best friend died when I was 43. And I had fallen in love with the art form, and it was during this time that I realized that if I created stories about them, I would keep them alive, the memories of them at least alive. But I wasn't ready to tell the story of my friend's death. So I went in another direction of a kitchen mishap. And so while Janine, in her four-evening introduction to storytelling, recommended that everyone work on a folk tale, I said, I actually came here to work on a personal story. She said, well, that'll be a nice contrast to the rest of them. So.
And Janine Laverty is one of the deans of our storytelling circle here, and she's been a guest on the show, and she's also on our webpage, so if you're looking for someone who might want to teach you more about storytelling, Janine Laverty is one of those people. And just to remind you what's been going on, we like to think about stories as a medium and as an art form that has really two purposes and another driver. And the two purposes are to entertain and to teach. And the other thing that really drives a story is that it can generate connections in the listener's mind and heart. And that little bit of connection is part of the art form, I think. So,
and another way of thinking of gives, an Irish author said, stories should entertain in the moment and give memories worth having.
I love that. I love that.
Yeah, so that's the connections you have that the story has brought out in your life, the connections with the people you've listened to. Yeah, memories worth having.
Speaking about memories worth having.
And other teachers in this area.
And other teachers in the area. How many memories do we have because of Marni Gillard? I mean, I have a lot of really good memories because of just hanging out with Marni Gillard.
And even when there was a radio show, the Storycrafters had a radio show on WMBC, I could always tell if Marni was in the audience because she's the first one who laughs.
First laugh.
I would go, there's Marni.
We would like to introduce you to our guest for the show. Marni Gillard is here. And Marni Gillard is one of the other deans of storytelling here in the capital area. And we're pleased to have you with us today. And what can we say of Marni? Marni is a retired, a little early from being an English teacher in the Niskayuna system, got attracted to storytelling, and you moved into a life as a storyteller.
I certainly did. I took a leap of faith away from a good-paying job to be a freelance storyteller.
Flunked the sanity test again. Okay.
But it was a great decision for me on a number of levels. There's all kinds of things that just the conversations you've been talking about have brought up in me. But
why don't you tell us a little bit about the journey? Because I know there's a book, because I've got your book that you wrote for the rest of us, and as well as probably yourself to get it all on paper. But when you actually made that leap, what had you been doing prior to that gave you the confidence to move into storytelling?
Well, it's a funny thing. When I was a girl, I probably wanted, deep down inside me, as many young girls do who watch television, I had a vision of myself as an actress. And if there were anybody I wanted to be like, it might have been Annette Funicello, who was my heroine on the Disney shows that I watched as a little girl. But as I grew older, two things happened. My mother was very commonsensical, and she said, now, you always want to have something that you can fall back on. So you really probably want to have the teaching degree when you go to college. My mother was a teacher, my father was a teacher, my grandmother had been a teacher. So that was a fall back on. I'm like, wait, what exactly am I falling back from, Mom? When I'm falling apart and I'm falling back on this. So that was one thing, is my mother steered me toward teaching. But the other, and I don't think I ever realized until we were just talking a minute ago, was I had a big story inside me. And that was the story of my dad's death. And death, when it's in you as a young person, it's working on you. You're a little embarrassed to talk about it at the time. My dad died very suddenly, and I was embarrassed, really, about it, as much as sad about it. My mother didn't want to talk about it. It was hard on her. She had 6 children to raise. So I didn't want to talk about it exactly, but we didn't talk about it. It was sort of a stoic Irish kind of thing. And, you know, that happened. We're moving on. And we did. And I had a great life, and I loved being a teacher. But I had that self-expression from the yearning to go into a drama inside me. And I loved reading aloud. So I'd read aloud to my students. I took my time. I tried different voices, and they were, you know, always right there with me. So very early in my career, I started a reading aloud unit. And I was an English teacher, so fit right in language arts. Everybody could find an excerpt, and they practiced reading. We held up our books. We sometimes used our right hand to keep the place so we could look up. I still believe we need way more of this in schools, because people don't read aloud well unless they've been trained to. And it's very much a part of the Irish legacy. I grew up where we sang aloud, and my grandfather would say, tell the story, meaning sing with expression and feeling. Jump ahead to two storytellers came to the Albany area, to Albany Library. They were called the Folk Tellers. George Ward had brought them for the Niskayuna Folk Festival, and Patsy Patrick had snagged them to come over to the Albany Library, and it was about 1980. And I watched them tell a story that they were so proud. They had contacted Maurice Sendak and said, we're telling where the wild things are as a story without holding up your book. We always say your name. And he said, tell it away, tell it. So they were very proud of that. A young woman by the name of Becky Holder happened to be there that day, and she was somebody I met. Few more years go by, and I'm back to teaching. I had been home on leave, maternity leave, and I went back to teaching, and it was 1983, and at Oneonta, there was a day-long workshop on storytelling led by our friend Janine Laverty and many others, lots of women from Oneonta, and Sue Spivak gave a workshop. She'd been part of our story circle years ago. Others that I met, and I just was hooked. I came home that day and said, I'm throwing out the read aloud unit and changing it to a storytelling unit. I don't know exactly how to storytell, but we're going to figure it out, my students and I, shoulder to shoulder. So I did that, and another thing was happening at the time where I'd been with a new teacher. I'd been going to grad school in the summer with Lucy Calkins down at Teachers College in New York, and she was teaching the art of teaching writing in a very, very new and bold way. Not everybody's going to write the same assignment, not, okay, here's the topic sentence, here's blah, blah, blah. She said, we're helping children find their voices, their unique voices and what they want to write about. And as I was taking some classes also at Oneonta on that, they were very hooked up with the storytelling world. And Lucy, my teacher at Teachers College in New York, said, come down and do some storytelling for us. So I was brand new at it, and suddenly I'm doing it for other teachers. And I had a wonderful experience. It's just a fun little story. I told a fairy tale that I had recently reconnected with from childhood. Talk about retellings. As soon as I found this fairy tale book, which my mother had taken off to her classroom, it was like all the hair on my arm stood up. I know these stories. I don't have to learn them to tell. I can just open my mouth and they'll come right out because I heard them over and over and over. I asked for them as a child. And one of them was about a woman having a dipper of water, a girl really, and instead of taking it where she was supposed to take it quickly, she gave a little away and a little away to somebody else, a little away to somebody else, and it had a whole magical part to it. I told that story to a group of women, and 3 different women came up afterward, and they all told me, you know what that story really is about? And they had 3 different layers of meaning. And I said, oh, the audience makes of the story what is important to them. And that was a big enlightenment for me. Yeah, so that hooked me into some of these things that you were just talking about, how the audience affects the teller. The story is really interpreted by the audience in different ways.
Yes, Laura Sims says, I tell one story, but everyone hears their own version of it.
That's lovely.
I think of it as you're filtering it through your experiences. And a simple example is, once there was a barn. Now, I think of this barn that was on Grooms Road in Clifton Park that had a slate roof with the year on it that was torn down overnight because of a developer wanted to do it before the historian could finish taking pictures. But you just say a barn, and that's where my mind is. Somebody else could be a round shaker barn, or a barn, one of those that's just barely standing up. So that's a very simple example, but...
Yes. I often, when I'm hearing a story, I'll go to the home I grew up in, and I'll be placing that story somehow in my woods or park or a street game, or even if they talk about a tree, I'll see a tree in my backyard. A stairway, there's so many things. I'll go to that place because I now know, after 30 years of storytelling, I'm always working on myself. Old memories, teenage memories, all different, any struggles I had in life, I'm somehow bringing them to the story I'm listening to. It's a very interesting thing.
Okay, so that's storytelling in your classroom. But more recently, do we want to jump ahead to your new direction?
Yeah. I'd love that because I don't get to talk about this very much, and it's still very new. I've always been somebody who kept getting a certain amount of expertise and wanting another level. It's just the way I am. It's not any that I want to be smarter or wiser or anything. It's just like, well, each thing seems to lead me to something else. The way the reading led me to storytelling, and storytelling led me to leaping off to teaching teachers about it. Where did this exactly start? It started, Joe, as you were talking with me earlier before the show started. I've grown up Irish Catholic, but as I said, I'm interested in a lot of things, and I heard that there was a black Catholic church in the Albany area, in the Diocese of Albany, and it wasn't that far from me. It was in Albany, so I said, I'd like to go see what it would be like to go to a African-American but Catholic church. I usually associated church going as with Baptists or something like that if you were African American. No, indeed, a priest from Ghana by the name of Father Kofi Amisa. He's got a great middle name, a Ghanaian middle name. He'd been running that church for a while. He's been there now, I think, close to 40 years. I could be a little over the top on the number, but it's many, many years that he's still remaining. The church is now in Menands. It's part of the Joan of Arc parish. It's sort of a church within a church. But at that time, it was in Arbor Hill.
Yeah.
It was in Arbor Hill, in a place that's now a beautiful soup kitchen. Anyway, I visited them, and what an experience it was. hand clapping and dancing down the aisles. He actually, the very first time I went was one of their anniversary masses, and there's a really big fat book that sits on the altar, and Father Kofi placed that on his head, and he was dancing with this huge book on his head in the sanctuary. And our bishop at the time was a very, very serious and wonderful bishop, but very kind of quiet guy. He didn't do a lot of hand clapping and singing aloud, but he loved going there. You could tell he loved going in. And he sat as wide-eyed as I did watching this priest from Ghana. So joyful an experience. I stayed at that church for 7 years. And one of the things that happened was a really good friend that I made, a woman named Jackie King. She's a great leader in that parish. She said, Marni, I'm taking a master's degree at St. Bernard's. You can take it right in the Diocese of Albany, right on Main Street at the Pastoral Center where the diocesan offices are. I think you'd love it. You learn so much. There's things we learn that I never even knew about my religion. And at the time, you know, I just was like, thanks, Jackie. I'm not going back to Catholic school.
I've been there.
I went for 8 years as a kid, and I loved it. I did love it. It was a lovely growing up years, but the thought of going to Catholic college, no, I passed. I went to SUNY Albany, you know, and I got a nice secular education. She just kept saying, I think you'd like it. I think you'd like it. So a couple years go by, and there came a fall, believe it or not, where I wasn't making the money I was really hoping to make. That old teacher salary, still missing it. And I saw an ad for a Catholic school, but just straight religion teacher, not a literature teacher. I didn't have to mark papers and stuff like that. It would be just straight religion in middle school. And I liked middle schoolers. I had taught there in public school. And I thought, gee, maybe I could take one course and put it on my resume and make my little spiritual resume, because I had been doing a little tiny bit of teaching storytelling for forgiveness, or storytelling to know your spiritual history, just sort of generic spiritual work with adults, always with adults. But I thought, you know, it'd be fun to teach kids and use religion as story. There's so many wonderful stories in that big fat book we call the Bible. It's got a lot of stories in it. And I went to take a course. I actually just called the offices, and I said, my name is Marni Gillard, and I'm interested in, and I didn't get any farther before the person on the other end said, Marni Gillard, the storyteller? I said, yes, as a matter of fact. And the person on the other end, who later became my academic advisor, said, oh, yes, we know about your courses that you've given for the Consultation Center and the courses that you've given at Pyramid Retreat Center, Pyramid Life Center up in the Adirondacks. And I felt like it was a little bit of a sign to go. And of course, she wouldn't let me get away with taking one course. She was a sister of St. Joseph, Sister Catherine Hanley. She's very well known in the diocese, Kitty, we call her. And she signed me up for a master's degree before I knew what I could say no. And I ended up last spring, I got it. I got to take it very slow, one class at a time. It awakened me to saint stories I'd never even heard, or I'd heard in a very different way. And now I was hearing sort of an adult version, not the 4th and 5th grade version. It awakened me to the layers of meaning, as you were talking about when you repeat a story from Scripture. It awakened me to the writings of theologians all over the world, many of whom were Christian but not Catholic. It was sort of like I grew up fast. I always thought the Catholics didn't like Luther. He'd sort of messed with our church. Well, wasn't Luther right on our list of theologians you might want to study? I said, wow, when did we start liking the Protestants? So it's still an awakening. I'm still going through very much of a rebirth. And I'm not selling my religion to anybody. As a matter of fact, I'm very involved in interfaith storytelling, and that's been one of the assets I brought to my fellow students, my colleagues, and at the St. Bernard's Theological Institute.
St. Bernard's is a great place. Based in Rochester, as I remember.
It's based in Rochester, but it has these classes you can take in Albany. It has classes you can take in Syracuse, and now it's expanding to have so many things online. So you could be in Oneonta and take classes online. Up somewhere far north, you could take places online. So it's really expanding. It was a wonderful experience.
You know, I'd listened to you forever. I'm fascinated by the story, and I've kind of watched you live parts of it. So, but I'm wondering, could you tell us a story?
That was my thought.
Oh, was that your thought too? Boy, we think a lot alike.
Yeah.
I thought you'd never ask. But before I start, I just want to say, one of my experiences is that stories are short or long, and that can be the same story. So we're going to tell the 10-minute version of something that could be a much longer story, and maybe it's one you've heard before, and maybe it isn't. Whenever St. Patrick's Day comes around, I like to tell the story of St. Patrick as a teenager. It's not a story I'd ever heard when I was a teenager, and it's an amazing tale. One summer night, at a beautiful, you might say, seaside home. Really, it was probably a whole number of buildings where a family that was a Roman British family lived on the coast of Britain, and they'd actually gone back to their city home, the adults of the family, and they'd left home their teenage boy, whose name was probably a Roman-sounding Patricius, something like that. And that boy, that teenage boy, like many boys, many teenagers in general, had really kind of put his faith behind him. His dad was a deacon in the church. His grandfather was actually a priest in a time before priests were celibate in the Catholic Church. It was a Catholic, Christian, Roman flavored experience that he'd grown up in. He was learning Latin and struggling with it. And we know all of this because of some letters that he left much, much later in his life. Well, that boy was probably, as I could see my teenage son sprawled out on his bed, middle of the night, and suddenly he had a blindfold on, tape or the like of tape, ropes, whatever, a cloth in his mouth. He had a chain around his neck, and he was abducted by Irish thieves. Very professional, we might say. They knew their stuff because this was in the 400s. The 400s. And Rome had fallen, and they'd pulled their ships out of that sea between wild and crazy Ireland and the much more tame British Isles. And that boy was thrown into a boat, probably with women that had been abducted, probably with other young men. They had to be careful. The commentator that I listened to said, oh yeah, if you have a small boat, you got to pick and choose who you're going to kill and who you're going to take to become a slave. And he was taken across that channel over to Ireland, sold quickly, a strong young man, and taken far, far into the depths of Ireland, way up in a mountain, through forests, very few roads, to a place. People argue about exactly where it was he might have been taken to, but for the next 6 years of his life, he was on a lonely mountain caring for sheep and goats, given very little food, just enough to keep him surviving so he could be in the slave of a household of probably a big landowner. And that boy was lost and lonely. And all he really had to turn to was what his father and grandfather and his family had taught him about God. And he began to go back in his memory to any prayer he could remember. They say that probably what he was doing a lot of the times was reciting psalms that he'd maybe memorized as a young schoolboy. And he chanted and he sang and he called for help. There was nothing else he could do but just survive in the rain and the cold. It's a pretty rainy, coldy place, Ireland. And he cried and he sang and he cried and he sang, and years went by. And they began to tease him, calling him holy boy, holy boy. And one night he had a vision. He had a voice come to him in the night and say, "Your ship is waiting. Run. Run as fast as you can. Your ship is waiting." And he kept asking, well, where do I run? Where do I go? And all he heard was this message, go, go. And with every bit of his courage, knowing he could be killed as a runaway slave, just as we know in our own country, he ran, he ran, he ran, he ran, he ran, until he came to a seashore. And there was a boat ready to take off, a small boat, but with a captain and some sailors. He saw they were getting ready. He looked around, hoping no one would recognize him. And he went to the captain, who said, absolutely no. If you're a runaway, I'll get in trouble. I'll lose my ship. Get out of here, kid. But the other sailors, looking at the boy and seeing again how strong he was, come on, let's take him on, Captain. We don't have to pay him a penny. He'll just be a worker. He just wants to get away. Come on, he's a kid. He wants to get back to his life. And they let that boy on his ship. Of course, they had to listen to him talk about prayer. He'd become a missionary pretty fast, and all he did was talk about it. But when they got to the coast of England, they'd been thrown off course, and all they saw was swampland and trees. But the captain still said, we've got to get through this. We'll find our way. We'll find our way. We've got a cargo we've got to get, and we don't have time to search for the next port. They got off the ship. Before you know it, they are through swamplands and forests, and they are lost, and the water's run out, and the food has run out. And he says to them, we've got to pray. They said, you pray. You're the one they called holy boy. You told us that story. You pray. He says, no, we got to all pray. You're all going to pray, or it's not going to work. He got these old tough sailors to pray on their hands and knees. And next thing you know, a herd of swine comes crossing their paths. And, probably 50 swine that had run away from somebody. And they snatched up the ones they could catch, and they built themselves a fire, and they had enough food. And whether any of them became Christians like that boy would have wanted, I don't know. But he got back to his parents. And at first, they didn't want to let him go. They didn't want him out of their sight. He was 21 years old now. He'd missed years of education. It was a rough homecoming. And he tells about this in those letters that were left. But eventually, and a lot of those years are missing, he got himself to a priest who trained priests. He went all the way to Rome. He got himself ordained. And then he began to have visions again that were a voices saying, holy boy, come back to us. Holy boy, come back to us. And somebody who identified himself as victorious in those visions said, Ireland is calling you back. And do you want to go back to the place that imprisoned you for 6 years of your life? He resisted. He resisted for a long time. He was probably an old man by the time he went back. But the St. Patrick we've come to know in adulthood had that teenage boy's scary journey, but big conversion back to his boyhood belief. And didn't he turn an entire Ireland into a place that is still holding fast to their Irish beliefs in the three gods? He say it's a legend perhaps that he taught them with the shamrock to believe in the three, Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit of God. So I love that teenage story. I love that teenage story.
Great story. Thank you, Marni. Thank you, Marni.
Thanks for asking.
You really brought him to life. That there was nothing stuffy and da 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 da.
No, there's not really a preacher in me. As much as those black Catholics were working on getting me to be a preacher, I do love to read the scriptures aloud. I love it. But I read with great expression, and people often thank me and say, I never heard the story before. A teenage girl once came running after me after I'd just story told some scripture. I wasn't even reading it. She said, I was there. I was there on the road to Emmaus. I've heard that story all my life. And so, yeah, I have fun with it. I have fun.
Now, this is going to be an unfair question, since I've known you for a long time. Do you think you tell that story because you've kind of had a number of your own calls along the way? That you've heard that boat, your boat's ready? Because while I was listening to you, I kind of heard that same kind of, she caught that boat,
Oh, thank you, Joe. Thank you for saying that. Well, here's what I will tell you. Because not everybody who grows up with a Catholic school education stays Catholic, And in my family, I have, some others have. I did have a cousin that was a priest, called to the priesthood, and he was a wonderful priest, Thomas Walsh. But when I was in the 4th grade, my first call, if you would say, was the teacher saying, Marguerite, would you stay after school? And I thought I was in trouble for a little while. And then I was asked to start singing the morning mass, 7 in the morning, and then 7:30, and then she'd feed me breakfast and I'd go to school. And singing...
This is in church, not in school.
I'd go to school, Catholic school that was right next to church.
Okay.
So the church organist, who was our music teacher, and the choir, was our choir teacher. She's the one that said, will you come and sing morning mass tomorrow?
She would sing the response. The priest would sing the priest parts, and she would...
Oh, yes, but you have to sing, any Catholics out there would know, the Kyrie, the Gloria, the Sanctus, the Agnus Dei. These are all the Latin songs. Kyrie is actually Greek. And I didn't have to sing the Confiteor or the Creed. The Credo, because it was just too much Latin to learn in a short period, and usually somebody else would sing that. So the organist, despite the fact she had laryngitis, that's why she asked me, she sang those parts, and I just sang the others. But eventually I sang at funerals and weddings, and you could make a lot of money as a little girl doing that. So probably that was the beginning of my being a freelance artist.
Wow.
There's more calls. Yes. I could talk forever.
We have just 20 minutes left of this show.
Gosh.
We're going to take a break, Marni, and then we're going to tell folks about what's coming up in the storytelling around the area, because we'd like you to know.
Yes.
Okay.
Well, the first thing is that Marni is doing a series with John Courtney, who's a bibliodramatist, stepping into the Bible through storytelling. Improvising to make sense of Scripture. And it started on March 31st, but it's continuing on April 7th, 14th, and 21st, 7 to 9 p.m. at the Pastoral Center on North Main Street in Albany. You need to register through the Consultation Center, and you can see the phone number or the email contact below. So that's one direction that your new... one of the... kind of work that you are doing now in your new direction in storytelling. Mm-hmm. And then something that you have been helping to organize. Stories for Racial Healing, a series of community conversations on racism. The second session in Schenectady is happening on Tuesday, April 5th.
Right.
Again, from 7 to 9.
And viewers may remember we had 2 guests from the Albany Society of Friends who had kind of started the program here in Albany. And this is kind of an expansion or extension over to Schenectady. And you're all welcome.
At the...
It's at the Mount Olivet Missionary Baptist Church, which is down near Union College in that triangle plot of land between Park Avenue and Wendell Avenue. And the address is there. And it's also the headquarters for the Schenectady Inner City Ministry.
Also known as Sikkim.
Sikkim.
Sikkim, Joe, Sikkim.
I have a story about Sikkim.
Yes. On April 8th, Friday, April 8th, the second Friday of the month, the Shawnee Evening at the Irish American Heritage Museum is going to be with storytellers Mary Murphy and Barbara O. Palumbo.
Barbara O. Palumbo, yes. And that's always a wonderful, wonderful evening, and you get home-baked Irish shortbread, soda bread.
Soda bread.
And that's always kind of a neat evening.
And then on Sunday, April 10th, will be our last wordplay for this season at Proctor's. The topic is Luck Strikes.
Luck strikes.
And this could be obviously good luck or bad luck.
But it strikes.
It strikes with some of our favorite storytellers, all of whom have been on this show. Fran Combs-Berger, Janet Carter, Sandy Schumann, Siri Allison, and Claire Nolan.
What a wonderful lineup that is. That's
yes.
a great go.
And then speaking of Claire Nolan, 2 days later she will be at the first Tuesday, which is the second Tuesday because of the Stories for Racial Healing is on the first. Yes. So the first/second Tuesday, April 12th, at Arthur's Market in the Stockade.
And at Arthur's you can bring songs you want to sing and poems you want to read and stories you want to read. And we have a wonderful sense of fellowship there, and there's some fine food to have as well. So don't be a stranger.
Okay. Then up in Saratoga, the storytelling open mic there. In April, it's at Woodlawn Commons on April 13th, 7 to 9, and it's free when it's there. So please come to tell stories, not to read them.
That's the least expensive storytelling venue you'll ever find right there.
None of them pay you to come.
Right.
No.
Right.
Can't get any cheaper than that. Then down in Saugerties, which really isn't that far away from here, is Storytelling with Janet Carter on the third Friday of the month, which is April 15th. Celebrate by getting your taxes in early and go to the Inquiring Minds bookstore at 7 o'clock. And then, we still have 2 more things to talk about. Our next Story Circle meeting is on Tuesday, April 20th at the Pine Hills Library in Albany at 6:15 to 9. Again, telling, not reading. You could have a little outline you might glance down at, but that's as far as we really want you to go. Then, finally, a program that I'm doing at the Shenendehowa Adult Community Center, Chocolate Delights.
Ooh.
Where each of the stories has at least a taste of chocolate in it. And they include just a quick story about a bishop in Mexico who banned chocolate from being drunk during a mass and what happened to him.
Ooh.
A story of how Eskimo pies were created. A story about my best friend who made a baume au trois chocolat. And the story of the candy bomber during the Berlin blockade.
Yeah.
And others.
And others.
Yes, there are some knitters in Peru, I believe it is, and there was a surgeon there who wanted to make like shunts for kids, little tiny kids. Mm-hmm. And these women are knitting with wire to make these medical shunts and things. I mean, knitting is not just for socks and mittens.
Notice how she transitioned from chocolates to mittens to knitting. It's amazing. You can really just do that.
I'm doing a knitting program also
Okay,
in April for the Academy for Lifelong Learning.
Okay.
But that's a private thing, so
Okay. All right.
you can't just drop it on that. So we only have like 14 minutes left, guys.
You got another story, Marni?
I do. I'll try to keep it under the timing.
And
I'll
this
try to
is-
make it short.
This is 4 minutes too much. So you have to stop by like 15.
15?
Yeah.
3 minutes story.
Oh, no, I'm sorry, 5.
5.
Yes.
Stop by 5. Okay. Here's what I want to say just before I start my story. That, we're talking here about learning. When I was learning about St. Patrick, this was the first book I found, St. Patrick, the Real Story. And I know that, Kate, you have been such a teacher to me in researching things, researching history. I also found St. Patrick of Ireland, and between these two books, so much you never knew about St. Patrick, if you're somebody who's interested in that. Also, I have learned a new historical story. Again, thank you, Kate, because you are such the queen of the history and looking into it. But this is a story I heard as a little girl in Catholic school, Our Lady of Guadalupe. Now, when I first heard it, I heard it from a nun who just told it like a little story, little miracle story. And I thought the man who's in the story, Juan Diego, was a boy about my age. I just turned him into me, as we were talking about before. But this man, Virgil, or we might say Virgilio Elizondo, he is a Mexican-American priest, born in San Antonio of Mexican parents, and now he is a professor at where's the college out west? It's the big Irish Catholic college that everybody knows. Notre Dame, of course. Thank you. And how could I not be thinking about Notre Dame with this is Our Lady of Guadalupe?
You had a language.
I had one of those sweet senior moments.
Well, French.
Notice it was the Protestant that got that right.
but it's the garbled French, and you were
garbled
talking
French.
about a Mexican. So
Okay,
that's-
Exactly. I was jumping cultures. So here's just a little version of the new story that I understand today. In the 1500s, when Spain came to Mexico and discovered it as if no one had existed there before, Cortez decimated the Aztec culture. And he did it in the name of a young man wanting to discover and make gold, but at the same time, he did it in the name of God, saying he would bring Christianity, with violence. And about 10 years went by, and a lot of people have converted because, hey, if they're going to kill you or turn your religion, a lot of people would say, sure, we'll take your religion. And this person, Juan Diego, who I thought was a little boy on his way to morning mass, as I could picture myself going to sing morning mass, he was a 57-year-old man whose wife had been killed by the smallpox, which we know only came from the Europeans, and whose elderly uncle had sort of watched over him as a boy and now tried to steady him as a grieving man. He was quite elderly himself, but the two of them had been one of the early converts, again saying, hey, we believed in our Aztec gods. If you got a different name for God, we'll take that. We're connected to the divine. Well, one day, early in the morning, because it's about a 15-mile walk, he's going from his house in the dark, so he could go to morning mass where he knew he would get more education about this new faith. They actually took attendance for the new converts to say who's here, who's really in with us, and who's not. And he was dutiful. He was a young, 57, wanted to do this right. He had a high standard for himself. And his uncle couldn't go, but he and his uncle shared this. And suddenly on the way past a great hill, the hill of Tepeyac, where the goddess used to be worshipped, where a great Aztec shrine had been, but now gone, long gone, he heard music, bird song, but musical, harmonizing bird song. What could this be? This felt like heavenly music to him. And even though he wanted to be at church on time, he climbed that hill, and there before him was the most amazing sight of a woman with rays of light coming out from her body. Her clothing was all designed with Aztec symbols. Aztec symbols. And he couldn't believe it. It was so amazingly beautiful. The colors, these symbols over her clothes. Clearly she was pregnant. She had a rope tied around her body growing here. And he was like, "Who are you?" And she said, Juan, my beloved, abandoned son. I've called you here. I want you to go when you're going to see now the church. Talk to the bishop and tell him to build me a church, a chapel. She used words in his language. She was speaking to him in his own language. This is not Mexican Spanish the way we know today. She was calling on one of these people whose culture had been destroyed, and said, go to the bishop. And she used words like hermitage, home. She said many, many different ways. Have him come to build me a place here. And he is like, "Who are you?" And she said, "I'm the Mother of God. This Jesus you're learning about, I'm her." And then she said, "I am Tonantzin, the name of the goddess." So she's giving us the message 500 years ago to wake up that the divine is the divine. There's no owning it. There's no killing people to say this is it and this isn't it. Go now, tell him to come and rebuild me a home here. And he's kind of like, "Are you sure you want me? I'm a little native man. I'm a little indigenous man. You want a Spanish person, I think." She said, no, go. You're the one. Off he goes. The bishop doesn't believe him. First of all, it's a big job to even get in to see the bishop. Won't believe him. No. Thank you. You saw the Mother of God. Lovely. I'm happy. Go. And off he goes. And he comes back and says, "He didn't believe me. I didn't think he would, and you didn't think he would. Go again." Just go again. Try again. Tell him this. Say it again. I really want it. I'm the Mother of God. Off he goes. The bishop is like, a little hard to believe that you'd come back again, but I got to have proof. You got to give me a sign. I got to have proof. So he goes back, and she says, "Come back tomorrow. Tomorrow we'll have a proof." But when he goes home that night, he finds that his uncle, also a Juan, and by the way, the bishop's name was Juan, 3 Juans, very metaphorical. Juan Bernardino, he has now come down with the smallpox, and he's near death. And he thinks, "I can't go back to the lady. I gotta go get the priest," because he's learned you can't get to heaven if you haven't had this sort of special prayers when you die. So he's sneaking past the hill like he can hide from her. And she's, "Oh, Juan, come up. You can't sneak away from me. I'm the Mother of God." And he goes back and he says, "But I got to get the priest." She said, "Your uncle is well. I am connected to the divine. Your uncle is well. Now, go get the
the priest.
bishop, and before you go, let's give him the sign. So that was actually on the road down at the bottom of the hill, because he's sneaking around and she catches him down there. They go up to the top of the hill again, and this is now winter. It's December. Historically, December 9th through 12th, we celebrate this. There are beautiful flowers. Some, the indigenous people say, multicolored, beautiful wildflowers of every kind. The story has come to be roses. Roses growing in Mexico. No roses growing in Mexico before. On a hill in winter. She tucks them into his tilma. It's not like a vest that opens like this. It sort of goes across him. So to open it, you lift the whole flap. And she tucks all the roses into his tilma. He goes, she don't open it for anybody but the bishop. Down again, the servants again give him trouble. What do you got there? What do you got there? Oh, somebody sewed some flowers on your tilma. And sure enough, it looks like flowers knitted or sewn or crocheted. Finally gets into the bishop, and the bishop's like, you got a sign? Yes, yes, yes. And he's very humble, very respectful. Here's the sign. And he thinks it's the flowers themselves. And he opens, and the flowers fall to the ground, and the bishop drops to his knees, sobbing, but he can't take his eyes off the man. And he looks at the bishop. Why? He sort of understands. Oh, you're embarrassed? You said no? And the bishop says, no, look. And here on his tilma that he's held open is the image of the lady with all the rays of fire coming out of her, the multicolored flowers, the beautiful Aztec symbols. My beautiful friend brought me this from Mexico. And there is the Virgin printed on his tilma. And from December 9th to December the 12th, millions of people to this day go to Mexico City. And they have to get on now. It's a moving walkway, so they won't stop and stare too long. It's like going to see the Book of Kells in Ireland. It's like, keep the people moving. They go and they look up at this tilma, same tilma, that 500 years ago, it long ago should have deteriorated. It was a little cactus fiber, and it's under glass, protected, and you can see the picture he saw. And indeed, the bishop built him a chapel, which later became a church, which later became a great basilica, and that's Our Lady of Guadalupe, which is actually when she cured his uncle. As she's talking to him, she's appearing to the uncle as well, saying, have them call me the Lady of Guadalupe, which is actually a Spanish name. And it's a great political story, a great historical story of a miracle. We have a hard time in the 21st century and even the 20th believing in miracles, but the people of faith believe strongly. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Wow.
That's my story.
Very cool.
I think it's kind of a miracle story in and of itself, don't you? Just to listen to it.
Yeah.
Thank
Wonderful.
you. Thank you. Thank you.
Catechism was never like that.
I never felt like I could tell these stories in any kind of a public venue, but as soon as I started telling them, just like the stories of my dad's passing, it's a big story, and I'm not reluctant to tell it anymore. Somebody needs the story. I'm not trying to change anybody's way of thinking. I just love the stories, and people find themselves in the story in many ways.
You do. You find a little bit of a plug too, because the Interfaith Story Circle that's been going for 10 or 15
20 years, over 20.
Is a gathering, and they're also on the web, and the group gathers 10 times a year in various faith communities. And if you have an interest in kind of openness and shared spirituality, I would recommend it, because there's usually a theme, and it's usually in a different place of worship, and it's probably some of the best fellowship we've all experienced at some point in time.
Yeah.
So
interfaithstory.org/Tri-City.
/Tri-Cities, that's right.
Okay. And we have to go now. So thank you very much for joining us. We hope you come back next time.
Good cheer.
It goes all my life's a circle, sunrise and sundown. The moon rolls through the nighttime till the daybreak comes around. And all my life's a circle, I can't tell you why. Seasons spinning round again,